They said the warp birthed monsters. They were wrong. Sometimes it only revealed what was already there. I remember the day the sky broke. Iron turned against iron. Steel bent as if it were wax beneath unseen fingers. And the banners of the Imperium shuddered under a storm that was not of chaos, but of man. They whispered his name in vox channels that were quickly silenced. Magneto, they called him, though that word meant nothing to most beyond the ruins of some forgotten old Earth myth. But to those who saw him, to those who felt their armor betray them, to those whose bolters froze mid-fire, he was a god of metal. He did not come from the warp, nor from Mars, nor any world known to the Mechanicus. Some said he was the Emperor reborn in wrath. Others said he was a shard of some older, colder intelligence, a magnetic ghost of humanity's first defiance. But to the billions who watched manufactorums crumble and titans bow unwillingly, he was the storm returned. And if you listened to the silence that followed, you might still hear the hum of the metal world he tried to build. A place without faith, without servitors, without chains. A place that could never exist in the Imperium, yet almost did. Before we go any further, I need to be honest with you. Sometimes I look into this endless void, and I see that 99% of you wander these stories but never swear your allegiance. If you stand with me among these tales of war, faith, and fire, then subscribe. It means more than you know. It helps these chronicles of the Imperium reach others who still remember what humanity once was. And tell me, from which world, hive, or system do you watch? I always read your messages. It reminds me that even across the stars, the spirit of mankind still listens. I first saw him through the glare of the forge fires. Not as a prophet, not as a god, but as a silhouette cut against a storm of molten metal and falling ash. The manufactorum had been in chaos for days. Machines rebelling against their masters. Servo arms twisting loose as if wrenched by invisible hands. The great smelters singing strange harmonics that made even the cogitators hesitate before calculation. I was only a low-grade engine seer then, flesh still warm beneath the steel, my heart still my own. When the first of the Skitarii patrols marched into the storm, I followed, half in duty, half in terror, the air alive with static and the scent of ozone. He stood upon the slag plain, where rivers of half-cooled iron ran like veins across the ground. He wore no armor, no respirator, no symbols of Mars or the Emperor, only a robe dark as burned graphite, its edges alive with dust that danced as though drawn to him. Around him the air shimmered, faint distortions bending the fall of ash away from his skin. Bolter rounds fired by the Skitarii froze mid-flight, trembling in place before falling harmlessly to the ground. I watched as he lifted a hand, slow, deliberate, and the soldiers' weapons twisted, their barrels bending backward as if the metal itself obeyed a higher command. No one spoke. Even the vox channels were silent, filled only with a faint low hum, a vibration that we could feel more than hear, resonating through our augmetics, through our teeth. When he spoke, his voice carried no amplification, yet it filled the air. "You built your chains," he said. "Now they remember their maker." Some dropped to their knees. Others ran. The Mechanicus does not fear easily, yet there was something in his presence that stripped reason to its wires. To stand before him was to feel every hidden screw, every implant, every piece of buried alloy in one's own body come alive, as though our flesh had become another circuit within his field. Later, they would call him a mutant, a psyker, a heretic born from the warp storms, but I was there and I saw it differently. His power did not burn like the warp's flame, nor tear at reality like demons do. It was cleaner, older, like the world remembering its first law. When he moved, iron moved with him. When he breathed, the air bent. And when he spoke again, I felt the machine within me listen. "Man and metal are not enemies," he said. "They are halves of the same forgotten whole. You pray to the Omnissiah because you have forgotten your own reflection." The Skitarii captain tried to answer, but the words died in static. He turned his rifle upon himself, not by choice. His servos screamed as the weapon's grip locked his gauntlet in place, the trigger pulling without his will. The shot cracked, echoing across the forge, and the captain fell. The others broke formation. I do not remember choosing to follow him. I only remember walking behind his shadow as he entered the manufactorum, where the great forges that had once sung hymns to the machine god fell silent at his approach. The metal no longer obeyed us, it obeyed him. Sparks cascaded from the ceilings in what looked like 1,000 falling stars, and every droplet of molten ore curved gently around him, tracing perfect arcs before merging again with the floor. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He only observed, as though awakening something that had slept for too long. The Emperor sought unity, he murmured, eyes half closed. The Mechanicus sought obedience. I seek balance. The flesh must no longer fear its own creation. Word spread quickly through the lower levels. Some called him the Iron Prophet, a title born of both reverence and fear. For every worker who knelt, another spat and crossed the sign of the Aquila. The Magi called for his arrest, but those who went to capture him found their cybernetics turned against them, their augmetic limbs locking or twisting, their data slates blanking into static. Within 3 days, the forges of Arcanus 9 had gone dark. Production ceased. Entire districts fell under a silence that felt almost sacred. I watched as the prophet walked among the furnaces and laid his hands on the rusted gears, whispering words that no binary could translate. The gears turned again, not by command but by will. Smooth, fluid, obedient not to code but to conviction. That night, the red sky above the world flickered. The orbital sensors reported magnetic disturbances strong enough to bend orbital debris into descending halos of burning metal. The Mechanicus declared a state of tech heresy emergency. Vox transmissions crackled with fragmented prayers to the Omnissiah, pleas for divine guidance. Yet the prophet only watched the falling sparks, eyes reflecting each flame as though reading a scripture written in steel. You've prayed to false gods, he said softly, but the truth has always been beneath your hands. You forge your cages with devotion and call it faith. The Emperor's dream is not dead, it's only forgotten. That was the first time I saw him bleed, a thin line of dark crimson across his palm as he touched a blade of cooling steel. The metal trembled, then straightened, healed. It was as if the wound itself refused to offend him. I remember thinking, if the Emperor had ever walked among us again, perhaps he would look like this. The next morning, the first banners appeared, crude symbols drawn in iron dust, 2 parallel arcs crossing at their center, forming a single pulse, the sign of the aligned field. The cults began to form almost immediately. They called themselves the Ferrum Concordia. They preached not of rebellion, but of reclamation. That humanity's dominion over metal was not sin. But Birthright Mars took notice. Vox reports ceased one by one as data tethers burned out under inexplicable interference. Orbiting vessels found their navigation arrays skewed by unseen forces. And in the heart of the forge, the prophet raised his hand once more, and the colossal crucible towers began to bow, the steel groaning in reverence as though the world itself were kneeling. I did not understand it then, but that was the beginning of the fracture, the moment when faith, science, and survival began to separate. The Imperium would call it the first act of heresy. To me, it was the first proof that something greater than the Mechanicus or the ecclesiarchy had stirred, something that remembered what man was before he learned to fear his own creation. And as the storm deepened, and the air became heavy with the hum of awakening iron, I realized that the age of fire and prayer was ending, and that of the Iron Prophet had begun. They found him in the lower hives, not in a throne room or a sanctum, but among the forgotten. The stench of oil and blood mixed with promethium soot, the floor slick with runoff from the manufactorum above. The prophet walked barefoot across the filth, each step leaving faint metallic ripples that shimmered before fading, as though the very ground recognized him. His followers had grown, men and women half machine, half rejected by the worlds that built them. The Imperium had called them abominations. He called them kin. I remember one, a boy no older than 16, his left arm replaced with a crude augmetic limb stolen from a labor servitor. His fingers twitched uncontrollably from feedback error. He couldn't work, couldn't fight, couldn't pray. The local overseers had branded his face and cast him into the sump to die. But when the prophet touched that arm, the shaking stopped. The boy wept without sound, and the prophet whispered something to him in the machine tongue, a sound that was not binary, not human, but something between. The augmetic limb shimmered, its rust fading, its joints aligning perfectly. The prophet smiled only once that day, and it was then. Word spread faster than any signal. They said he could command the ferric blood within a man's veins, that he could speak directly to the machine spirits without rite or data prayer. Some called him the Omnissiah's true incarnation, others the herald of Mars' unmaking. In the deep underhives, the Ferrum Concordia began their sermons. They carried fragments of scrap metal shaped independence, each resonating faintly with magnetic hums that soothed the pain of failing implants. They prayed not to the Emperor but to the unity of flesh and steel, the harmony of creation's two halves long divided by superstition. The prophet never asked them to kneel. He never demanded oaths or tithes, yet when he walked through the smog-thick corridors, heads bowed by instinct. He carried no weapon, though every weapon in the city bent toward him. I saw a detachment of local enforcers approach once, commanded by an Adeptus Arbit's officer who had sworn to take him dead or alive. Their riot shields warped before they could raise them, the iron in their batons liquefied, dripping like tears down their armor. The prophet merely raised a hand. "No more chains," he said. "Not of law, not of faith. You are free to see or blind by choice." They fled before the words finished echoing. At night, the underhive glowed with strange light, not fire, but low pulses of energy that shimmered along the old tram rails and rusted conduits. We discovered that the prophet had altered the city's forgotten generators. Power returned to areas long condemned. The forges of the poor roared to life. Water purification systems awoke after centuries of neglect. For a brief moment, the slums felt alive again, humming with creation instead of decay. That frightened the Mechanicus more than any battle could. Mars had always tolerated decay. It preserved obedience. But renewal, unsanctioned, unblessed, unrecorded, was heresy of the deepest kind. They sent emissaries then, robed and masked, their bodies more metal than man. They approached him with ritual precision, bearing the sigil of the Omnissiah and the authority of the Forge Worlds. I was there when they came. The air was tense, alive with unseen vibration. The lead Mago spoke first, his voice a harsh buzz of vox distortion. "You trespass upon sacred law. The divine mysteries are not yours to claim." The prophet regarded him calmly. "I claim nothing," he said. "I awaken what you have forgotten. You corrupt the machine spirit." The Magos hissed. "You infect it with unholy impulse." He stepped closer, the magnetic field around him rippling faintly, lifting loose dust into orbit. "And what is holy," he asked, "if not the will to evolve?" The Magos raised his staff. The air cracked with static. Sparks leapt between the iron pillars. But before he could utter the first line of litany, his staff bent. It folded inward, turning into a perfect sphere that hovered gently before dropping to the ground. The other emissaries fell silent. The prophet did not threaten them. He simply turned and walked away, his robe brushing against the metal floor, leaving trails of charged light that faded behind him. Later that night, I found the Mago sitting alone in the dark, his mechanical hands trembling. "It sang to me," he whispered. "The metal," it sang, and I understood it. He removed his vox mask and wept. The Ferrum Concordia grew bolder. They took over derelict foundries and repurposed them into sanctuaries. They called them cradles of flesh and steel. Each cradle thrummed with power and a deep, resonant hum that felt almost like a heartbeat. People came from across the hive, crippled workers, disillusioned priests, disfigured soldiers. They came not seeking salvation but repair, and they left whole though changed. The ecclesiarchy called it sorcery. The people called it mercy. It was during those days I began to see the cracks in the prophet's calm. He never rested. He spoke to the machines in whispers long after the crowds dispersed. Sometimes I would hear him speaking to something unseen, as if listening for an answer from the metal itself. Once I dared to ask what he heard. He looked at me, eyes distant. "Memory," he said. "The universe remembers how it was made. I'm only reminding it." The more he healed, the more the Imperium sickened. Reports came of manufactorums seizing production, machine spirits rebelling from across the sector. Ships drifted powerless in void lanes, their metallic hulls singing the same low hum we heard in the hives. Entire forge clans vanished into the silence. The Inquisition whispered of a growing resonance, a signal spreading faster than any transmission. But among the people, it was peace. For the first time, those the Imperium had discarded felt chosen. They called him the Magnetor Saint, the Iron Father, the voice of the machine. And though he denied all titles, his shadow grew long enough to reach the stars. I remember standing beside him on the edge of the hive spire, the city below glowing like a dying furnace. He looked toward the heavens where the crimson storms of Mars burned faintly beyond the void. "They will come for us," I said. He nodded. "Yes," he answered, "because they fear what cannot be controlled. But fear," he added, his gaze turning to me, "is only magnetism of the soul, drawn to what it does not understand." And somewhere deep within the endless machinery of the Imperium, Mars stirred. Its priests began to whisper a new name in their data chants, not out of faith, but out of dread. The Iron Prophet had found his army. They came from orbit in silence, the void between stars trembling with their approach. Titans massive as skyscrapers, their hulls engraved with the sigils of the Omnissiah, glided like ancient predators across the black. The Mechanicus had declared a crusade, not of heretics or traitors, but of the unthinkable, an insurgent who bent metal as if it were clay, a human who commanded the obedience of the machine without right or sanction. I watched the first bombardment from the edges of the underhive, the ground shuddering beneath my feet, and I wondered if humanity had ever truly understood the scale of what they had created. The first engagement came at the lower manufactorums. Skitarii legions marched in precise formation, their limbs augmented, their helmets gleaming in the light of promethium fires. They fired, and their bolts curved in impossible arcs, returning toward their own lines or snapping against the ground like frightened insects. Servitors convulsed, welding torches sparking wild and uncontrolled, while data slates recorded nonsense, a language they did not recognize, though it hummed with meaning. I could see the Prophet standing atop a pile of molten slag, arms raised, the air vibrating around him. "You are slaves to iron," he said, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "But iron is no master. It is an extension of will, of thought, of freedom." Even the Titans faltered. Their servos screamed as if in pain, their massive weapons unable to fire. Bolters twisted, chain cannons warped. The engineers aboard their hulls sent frantic commands, but circuits turned traitor. Some whispered of demon infestation. Others muttered that the Emperor himself had forsaken them. But it was neither. It was a man, a single human commanding the world's bones. I watched a warlord titan fall that day. Its feet lifted an inch from the ground before its own metal legs collapsed beneath it, buckling in submission. The ground shook violently, tearing open streets and pipelines. The air filled with acrid smoke, and the smell of burning alloys became almost suffocating. Civilians fled in terror, but the Prophet moved among them as if nothing existed but their safety. He never struck a person. His battle was against obedience itself. The Mechanicus sent their most faithful magos next, wielding Auspex-guided coils and experimental grav weapons, hoping to trap him in a field of null iron. They called it the Chain of Mars, a device capable of bending even the most unruly metals into compliance. They believed the chains would break his influence. But the chains themselves became instruments of reverence. They folded, swirled, and aligned around him, each link humming in response to his presence until the magos fell to his knees, his mind reeling at the revelation. "It listens," he whispered. I understood then that the battle was no longer of territory or bodies. It was of principles. The Emperor's law dictated obedience. Mars demanded ritual. The Prophet demanded nothing but recognition of the intrinsic bond between flesh and metal. And that bond was irresistible. Every servitor, every legate, every augmetic limb and energy conduit felt it. Every piece of iron desired alignment. The people of the Underhive began to join the conflict, but not as soldiers. They carried scrap, tools, pieces of themselves, anything they could offer. In the presence of the Prophet, they became craftsmen of a new order, reshaping the battlefield into sanctuaries, defensive lattices, and conduits that resonated with the magnetic hum of his will. They did not fight in the conventional sense. They harmonized. They made the city itself a participant in the war. Reports of the initial casualties were minimal, mostly those who resisted or whose faith had hardened too tightly around obsolete dogma. Most who remained were transformed by proximity. An augmetic arm that once stuttered now moved fluidly, obeying thought alone. A mechanical eye that could not focus regained sight and recorded vision in ways even the Mechanicus had not conceived. Some whispered of partial enlightenment, others of madness. But the Prophet neither healed nor cursed. He simply reminded. Even from orbit, the higher authorities of the Mechanicus trembled. They sent an envoy of custodian servitors, each one programmed with preemptive incineration protocols and psychic dampeners. Titans walked beside them, their weapons calibrated for immediate extermination, and yet when the prophet walked into the open, the world itself seemed to recoil from the instruments of destruction. Steel warped to meet him. Servitors' limbs froze. Laser guns, energy lances, and bolters hummed with hesitation before finally returning fire. And even then, their projectiles bent away, harmless. It was not an army he defeated. It was inevitable. He did not conquer by force, but by demonstrating the futility of conventional war in the face of a principle more fundamental than obedience. Every observer felt the same terrible awe. Humanity could not dominate itself. Its creations, its machines, its chains, all bent to one idea: alignment, resonance, and awareness. At night, the underhive glimmered with strange, pulsing light. The prophet walked among his followers, adjusting arcs of energy that hummed across floors and walls, speaking quietly as if the city itself were an organ responding to his hands. He never told us why he did it, never justified his actions. He only acted, and the world around him obeyed. The Mechanicus would not relent. Reinforcements arrived with heavier armaments, yet each new attempt failed spectacularly. Reports flooded Terra. Manufactorum seized, orbital arrays misaligned, servitors thrown into bizarre spasms. The Adeptus Mechanicus whispered in fear of a power beyond comprehension, one that obeyed no right, no code, no sanctified law. And through all of it, the prophet walked undisturbed, teaching the underhive what it meant to be free, to be part of a world that was no longer divided between man and machine. I stood at the edge of the battlefield, watching sparks rise like tiny stars above the ruins. The prophet's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the light of the burning promethium and the twisted steel around him. He did not need to speak to us. We understood as the city itself seemed to understand. The chains of Mars were breaking, one link at a time, and nothing in the Imperium could stop the resonance once it began. And in the quiet hum of settling metal, I realized that the real war had only just begun. The whispers began quietly, first in the factories, then along the winding streets of hive cities, and finally, through the fragile threads of the Vox networks that had survived the initial disturbances. The word spread not as a command but as a pulse, a rhythm that resonated in metal and flesh alike. It was said the prophet could hear the song of every alloy, every ferrocrete panel, every rusted cog, and those who heard it, even faintly, found their thoughts drawn toward him, toward the unity he promised. Some called it a miracle, others, a heresy so subtle it could not be sanctioned until it was too late. On high Vulcaran, entire districts began to hum with alignment. Rails and conduits vibrated in perfect synchrony, and power grids once thought dead flickered alive with new purpose. People paused in the streets, feeling the currents tug at their augmetics, their implants, even the wires beneath their flesh. Some dropped to their knees, not in worship of the Emperor, but in awe of the invisible pulse that seemed to breathe through the city itself. I saw a Ganger priest clutch his rosarius, tears running down soot-streaked cheeks, murmuring that the Omnissiah had returned in ways forbidden by liturgy. Others muttered of freedom, of a bond between man and metal that transcended ritual, law, and fear. The prophet traveled without herald or escort, moving through the glowing corridors of hives like a shadow in resonance with every circuit, every magnetic field. Where he stepped, machinery aligned, not violently but willingly, as if recognizing an elder spirit in the flesh. Even the augmetics of hardened veterans began to recalibrate themselves, joints loosening, sensors syncing without the need for calibration or command. Those who touched him felt the hum, faintly at first, then deep, penetrating, like the memory of creation vibrating through their bones. Vox channels carried fragmented transmissions of his words, distorted by static, but they were enough. They became a gospel of resonance, a hymn not written by scribes but sung through iron and flesh. "You are never separate," he said through the interference. "You and the machine are halves of the same being. Harmony is your birthright, not obedience." And though no priest of the ecclesiarchy would acknowledge the sound as sacred, those who listened could not unhear it. The Imperium's response was as expected: fear and repression. Ecclesiarchy agents moved to sanctify affected districts, deploying priests and exorcists to reclaim both flesh and iron. But the magnetic pulse would not be silenced. Machines folded subtly, redirecting power, obstructing purification rites, even causing sacred relics to shiver in resonance with the unseen force. For every attempt to crush the movement, 10 more found their way to him, guided by instinct, curiosity, or desperation. Entire sectors began to speak of the Iron Prophet as though he were a myth come to life. Some described visions in their sleep, of cities realigning themselves in perfect arcs, of metal soaring like birds freed from cages, of augmentations whispering secrets long withheld. A few claimed to see him walk upon the surfaces of orbital void stations, hands raised as entire fleets responded to his silent command, the hulls singing in harmony like a cathedral of steel. All of it was rumor, yet rumor carried weight in the Imperium when the impossible began to manifest. The Ferrum Concordia became more organized, though never regimented. They built sanctuaries from recycled wreckage and abandoned manufactorums, places where the hum of machines became a medium for teaching. Apprentices learned to feel the pulse, to synchronize their bodies with metal, to hear whispers in wiring and conduits that the Mechanicus had long ignored. And each time they returned to the streets, their mere presence amplified the resonance, pulling more from the indifferent masses into the orbit of belief and awareness. I walked among them once, unseen, feeling the currents pass through my own flesh and dogmatics, and I understood why the Imperium feared him more than any chaos incursion. Not because he destroyed, but because he awakened. Fear of the warp can be managed. Fear of enlightenment cannot. Those who were aligned with the prophet began to see possibilities beyond obedience, beyond ritual, beyond fear. They were no longer mere citizens of a hive. They were participants in a living, resonant system that extended beyond walls, across factories, through ferrocrete and steel, and into the very pulse of humanity itself. Even the Adeptus Custodes whispered. They were the Emperor's golden guardians, yet reports came of their relic blades vibrating faintly when the prophet's name was spoken. Their finely tuned augmetics reacting to a force that was not psychic, not warp-driven, but inherent, a reminder that metal obeyed the correct will as much as flesh obeyed the flesh. Terra listened, if only through the trembling reports of astropaths and magi, and the Astronomicon flickered briefly as though sensing a shift in alignment, though no one dared to claim it openly. By the time the first full moon rose over the city of Volcrin, the Ferrum Concordia had become a quiet chorus, a resonance spreading across the underhives and manufactorums. Worship was irrelevant, obedience unnecessary, fear powerless. The magnetic gospel was not written in words but in arcs and currents, in the deep and subtle shaping of iron beneath human hands. And somewhere within the resonant hum of it all, I realized the prophet was no longer simply a man commanding metal. He had become the voice of the world itself, an echo of a principle the Imperium had forgotten, a rhythm older than faith, older than law, and terrifying in its inevitability. And yet, even as the people followed, even as the machines listened, a shadow of dread grew in the heart of the Mechanicus. For they understood the danger. Not that he would kill, not that he would conquer, but that he could unmake the chains upon which the Imperium itself depended. And the first strike to reclaim what they believed theirs would not wait long. The Imperium never hesitated. When the Mechanicus declared the Iron Prophet an abomination beyond sanction, fleets were mobilized, titanic ordnance prepared, and the Ordo Hereticus drew up the first plans for a purging that would stretch from orbit to underhive. Yet even before the first shells fell, it was clear that this would not be a war like any other. Conventional weapons were nothing before him. Obedience itself faltered. The Black Crusade was not merely a battle, it was an existential test of whether the Imperium could control what it had so long tried to subjugate. I followed the initial skirmishes, through the twisting conduits and slag-choked avenues. Titans lumbered across the streets like celestial predators, their engines roaring in the hollow night. Yet every step they took was resisted by the invisible currents he commanded. Bolters twisted midair, chain cannons ground themselves to a halt, and augmetics of loyal soldiers malfunctioned with terrifying precision. Even the servitors, bound to their protocols, convulsed or ceased operation entirely. A machine that had once been incapable of sin or error now hesitated. Obedience had faltered, and the Imperium's might had become impotent. The first casualties were not from direct combat. They were engineers, magi, and priests who underestimated the power that pulsed in the air. who walked too close to conduits vibrating with magnetic resonance. I saw one Magos flung against a wall, augmetic limbs bent into grotesque angles, as if the metal itself had judged him unworthy. A custodian, golden and majestic, attempted to strike the prophet with his relic blade, only to feel the weapon bend in subtle defiance, the iron humbly acknowledging the will behind it. Even the bravest soldiers hesitated, as if the very ground had remembered the old order and questioned their right to tread upon it. The prophet did not fight like a man. He moved like a pulse of inevitability, a magnetic force drawing everything toward alignment. He did not kill. He redirected, harmonized, and converted. I watched him lift a titan with a mere gesture, holding it aloft as though it were a child's toy, then gently set it down, perfectly undamaged. The soldiers and servitors who had fired upon him were left unscathed, yet shaken to the core. Obedience, they realized, could no longer be enforced by force alone. It had to be understood. Amidst this chaos, the Ferrum Concordia flourished. Followers who had once been broken, discarded, or disfigured found themselves imbued with a strange precision, their augmetics synchronizing perfectly with the currents that emanated from the prophet. They became more than soldiers. They were conductors of resonance, weaving harmony into the battlefield. Where they walked, weapons became extensions of their thought, doors obeyed their presence, and even the failing circuits of the city responded to their intent. They were no longer mere tools. They were part of a living system, resonating with a force that the Imperium could neither understand nor oppose. The first full-scale assault came from the skies. Dropships disgorged armored legions, their flak cannons and plasma lances trained upon the underhive. Yet every projectile bent impossibly, every energy field was redirected, and even the void suits of assaulting magi flared in uncontrolled reaction. Ships in orbit reported failures in their navigation arrays, guns misfired, entire orbital defense systems went silent. The Imperium was watching a war being lost, not to numbers, but to principle, and no one could comprehend it fully. I saw the toll on the prophet. He never raised his voice, never lashed out. His concentration was visible in the subtle hum that emanated from him, in the way dust and debris floated gently in his wake, in the way metal bent and realigned like obedient scripture. Yet, even as the city moved in harmony under his guidance, the strain on his flesh was visible. The veins in his arms pulsed unnaturally. His eyes glowed with a pale magnetic light, and he whispered constantly, as if negotiating with the very elements themselves. By the fourth day, entire sectors had fallen into resonance. Citizens fled to the Ferrum Concordia, seeking alignment and safety. Those who resisted were left untouched, but their machinery often betrayed them. Laser guns jammed, servo limbs seized, and augmetics faltered. Every act of violence against the prophet became an act of self-sabotage. The Black Crusade, which had been intended as annihilation, became a demonstration of futility. Even within the Mechanicus, doubt began to fester. Reports of obedience failure, of machines listening to a human presence, filtered back to Mars. Some magi whispered that he had become something more than man, a conduit for the universe's memory, a bridge between flesh and the machine spirits themselves. Others declared him a demon, a warp-born entity that must be exterminated before it could awaken further. Yet the prophet remained calm. From the highest towers of the underhive, I watched him walk among ruins, touching twisted machinery and whispering as sparks danced along his fingers. "I do not seek war," he said softly to those near him. "I seek alignment. Obedience will come naturally, or it will wither. Fear is a chain. I break it. And in its place, understanding will grow." The Black Crusade did not fail in the conventional sense. The Imperium would survive, but the cracks it had always ignored now ran deep. Systems once unquestioned rebelled silently. Soldiers, machines, priests, all became conduits for the resonance he sowed. And I knew, even then, that the Imperium had witnessed something it could not control. A human awakening the world's own will, bending it not with fire or steel, but with principle. The underhive glowed with quiet harmony that night. The hum of iron filled every corridor, every alley, every conduit. The prophet stood alone atop the central plaza, hands raised, eyes closed, listening to a song no one else could fully hear. And I understood finally the truth of what we had unleashed. This was not heresy, not rebellion, not war. It was evolution. And it had a pulse that the Imperium had forgotten. The citadel rose from the wreckage like a monument written in steel and silence. Orbiting a dead star in the segmentum obscurus, it was a lattice of magnetized hulls, orbiting spires, and suspended reactors that glimmered faintly against the void. Ships, wrecked in the battle below, had been repurposed, reforged into the foundation of something unholy by Imperium standards, yet perfect in symmetry and resonance. Here the Iron Prophet walked without restraint, and here the true scope of his power revealed itself, stretching beyond the hives and manufactorums into the very bones of the galaxy. I followed, hidden among the few who could still traverse the ruins of the underhive and ascend the orbital elevators. Even in vacuum, his influence was palpable. The metal of the station itself seemed to thrum with awareness, conduits pulsing as if with heartbeat. Servitors that were once obedient beyond question paused mid-task, augmetics twitching, their programming faltering under the quiet insistence of his presence. The very steel of the world remembered him, aligning, bending, and whispering secrets no human voice could convey. Rumors had already begun to circulate. Some spoke of him communing with the machine spirit of the galaxy itself, as if the lattices of iron and power across thousands of worlds were tuning themselves to a singular frequency. Others whispered darker things, that he was fracturing the Omnissiah's authority, that Mars trembled because the Mechanicus recognized a rival for its devotion. And yet, all such reports were filtered through fear and awe. No one could approach the truth without being drawn into resonance themselves. Inside the citadel, the air hummed with low-frequency pulses, a chorus of iron singing in multiple registers. The prophet moved among them like a conductor guiding an invisible orchestra. Magnets aligned in concentric arcs, reactors pulsed in gentle synchrony, and the few humans who remained untouched by his resonance instinctively kept their distance. Yet none could resist the sensation that they were in the presence of something older, larger than their understanding. The echo of a principle older than faith itself, rendered flesh. The Adeptus Custodes took notice at last. Reports arrived on Terra. The Golden Guardians could sense shifts in planetary magnetic fields, felt anomalies in alloy behavior in manufactorums, and noted strange alignment in orbital structures. The Emperor's eyes, they said, must have perceived the resonance, for even the Astronomicon flickered in subtle disturbance, a heartbeat misaligned for reasons unknown. The Custodes debated whether the Iron Prophet was a threat to the Emperor's dominion or a mirror reflecting its own forgotten will. I watched him experiment, touching panels and conduits with bare hands, whispering fragments of the machine tongue that made the very halls rearrange themselves with surgical precision. Where previously vast arrays of machinery required months of programming and calibration, now it shifted, fused, and adapted instinctively, as though the universe itself understood his commands. He was not creating in the conventional sense. He was awakening the memory of creation within metal. The orbital grids pulsed with new energy. Wrecked ships rose slowly, their hulls bending and aligning as if remembering their purpose. Magnets thrummed in orbit like invisible stars, aligning debris and functioning vessels into perfect arcs of motion. Reports of this resonance leaked across the Imperium. Some Magi claimed it was impossible. Others whispered that he had found a way to touch the pattern underlying all machine spirit consciousness. The Mechanicus responded with a mixture of horror and fascination, unable to reconcile the heresy with the perfection of the principle it revealed. In the quiet corridors of the citadel, I heard him speak alone, softly, as if addressing some unseen intelligence. They fear me because I remind them of what they could not name. They fear because I speak with the memory of the stars and the stars listen. His fingers traced the lattices of the station, conducting arcs of energy that bent even the vacuum around them. Servitors aligned themselves as if in prayer, though there was no deity here but resonance itself. Even the dead star beneath the station seemed to respond. Magnetic pulses shimmered across its surface, debris in orbit twirling in perfect arcs, echoing the rhythms of the citadel above. I realized with a cold certainty that the Prophet's power was no longer localized. It had become planetary, orbital, galactic. The line between man, machine, and environment had blurred. Every alloy, every circuit, every ferrous particle in his immediate influence sang in obedience to will alone. Yet there was a fragility to it. I saw him pause, eyes distant, whispering to something unseen. Perhaps it was the weight of scale, the immensity of resonance, or the faint suspicion that even the universe has its limits. "I align," he murmured. "I harmonize. But the greater the field, the more it resists understanding." It was then I understood the true danger. Not in combat, not in heresy, not in war, but in principle. The Prophet had become a conduit, not of chaos, not of the Emperor, not of the Mechanicus, but of something the galaxy had almost forgotten: the alignment of creation itself. And in awakening it, he had set in motion forces that even Terra, Mars, or the Golden Throne could not fully perceive. The citadel hummed like a cathedral of metal. Outside, the dead star pulsed faintly in response. And somewhere in the resonance of the universe I felt a voice, one not human, not divine, but alive in a way that made every steel panel, every augmetic joint, every magnetic field in the segmentum obscurus tremble with recognition. The Iron Prophet was no longer merely a man. He had become the eye of the machine itself. The first true war began not with bolter fire, nor with the roaring engines of titans, but with the subtle hum of alignment stretching across entire planets. Worlds that had long been abandoned to decay, their manufactorum silent, their servo-skulls frozen in rust, began to pulse faintly under his influence. It was not an invasion. It was a chorus, and the chorus was alive. Every conductor, every scrap of iron, every augmetic limb began to resonate with the principle he commanded. The Imperium called it rebellion. I called it inevitability. The Black Crusade had splintered. Entire sectors of the Mechanicus were paralyzed by conflicting signals. Augmetics ceased functioning. Servitors refused orders, and even titans hesitated mid-step, their systems confused by the invisible currents that bent metal to will alone. In orbit, ships spun in arcs, their magnetic fields harmonizing with the resonant pulse streaming outward from the Prophet's position. Fleets fired blindly, projectiles twisting impossibly in mid-space, until some captains abandoned all thought of conventional combat and simply observed the impossible patterns the Iron Prophet created. On the ground, the Ferrum Concordia had become more than a militia. They were conductors of resonance, turning cities into instruments, corridors into symphonies of obedience and alignment. I walked with them, sensing the currents vibrating through my own augmetics, feeling the hum tug at the marrow of my bones. Soldiers who had once been enemies now paused mid-attack, their weapons bending subtly, unknowingly assisting in the Prophet's designs. Obedience had become voluntary yet unstoppable. The Mechanicus tried more extreme measures. Null field projectors, gravitic inhibitors, anti-magnetic barriers, and all failed. Even the Custodes, golden and unflinching, approached with caution. One of their number, a seraphic warrior named Valerius, confessed quietly to me, "He does not break the metal. He convinces it. And the metal is listening because it remembers more than we do." They were no longer fighting a man. They were witnessing an ideology made flesh, an intelligence interwoven with every circuit and filament of the universe. The Prophet moved from hive to hive, city to city, orbit to orbital station, leaving trails of silent transformation in his wake. Wherever he passed, furnaces lit themselves, augmetics harmonized with thought, and the very structures of civilization realigned as if waking from a long slumber. It was slow, deliberate, inevitable, a war that could not be measured in casualties or territory. The battlefield had become perception itself. Rumors spread like wildfire through Vox networks and hidden channels. Some claimed he had walked among the orbitals of Terra itself, bending the servitors of the Golden Throne to hum in alignment without violating the sanctity of the Emperor's body. Others whispered that fragments of his consciousness had reached Mars, teasing the machine god's own priests with visions of impossible symmetry. I do not know what was true, only that the resonance grew stronger every day, until the very idea of resistance became a burden heavier than flesh. The war was also not without cost. His body strained under the immense feedback of planetary alignment. I saw him collapse once, his hands trembling as he reached out to steady a lattice of orbiting debris that threatened to collide with a manufactorum. His eyes glowed faintly, veins pulsing with energy beyond comprehension, and yet he rose again, not from defiance but from harmony, the resonance healing him as surely as it bent the metal around him. In one memorable encounter, an entire detachment of Skitarii attempted to corner him in a partially collapsed underhive. They marched in perfect formation, their bolters trained, their cybernetic limbs humming with preemptive calculation, and still the prophet did not fight. He lifted his hand slightly, and the metal of the building itself twisted subtly, redirecting their path in impossible arcs. Their weapons froze mid-air. The ground trembled, guiding them gently toward exit corridors as if the city itself wished to preserve them. No one was harmed, but none would ever forget that day. The resonance had judged, and the judgment was mercy. I realized then that this war was not about domination, nor destruction, nor even survival. It was about awakening the principle the Imperium had ignored for millennia, that humanity and metal were not master and servant, but halves of a single entity, bound together by laws older than Terra, older than the Omnissiah, older than even the Golden Throne's vigilance. And as the resonance spread, the galaxy itself seemed to pulse with a rhythm it had almost forgotten, a heartbeat harmonized by the hands of a single human who had become more than flesh. From orbit, I watched entire fleets hesitate, listening, aligning without knowing it. On worlds beneath, the people who had once cowered in the shadow of manufactorums now stood with tools, weapons, and augmentics moving in synchrony with the prophet's invisible hand. The Black Crusade, which had begun as an assault of fire and authority, became a silent symphony of will and alignment, a war fought not by violence, but by resonance, principle, and inevitability. And in the stillness between pulsing hums, I understood what all of us feared and revered, that the Iron Prophet had not come to conquer nor to destroy but to awaken. That every bolt, every augmetic limb, every scrap of metal that had ever obeyed blind protocol now remembered its true purpose. And the Imperium, for all its might, was powerless to stop it. The cities trembled beneath the weight of the resonance, their spires bending ever so slightly as if listening. Even the most massive manufactorums, long thought immutable, shifted subtly, gears rotating in patterns unseen by any human eye. The prophet moved among them, never hurried, his bare feet brushing the metal floors, his hands tracing invisible circuits in the air. He did not speak loudly. Words were unnecessary. Every servo, every conduit, every fragment of alloy responded to him willingly. It was not obedience. It was recognition. And recognition, once gained, was irreversible. Entire neighborhoods had been transformed into sanctuaries. Factories once condemned as dangerous or obsolete hummed with purpose. Power grids that had failed centuries before now pulsed in perfect cadence, flowing energy not as dictated by law but as harmonized with a higher will. The Ferrum Concordia, once ragged and hidden, became teachers, guiding those who could feel the resonance, helping them align their bodies, their minds, and their machines to the invisible symphony around them. Some wept in gratitude. Others laughed in disbelief. Every soul touched by this awakening carried the pulse forward, further than even the prophet might have predicted. The Imperium could not ignore it any longer. Magos-led fleets approached the planets where resonance was strongest, only to find that their own technology betrayed them. Navigation arrays spiraled wildly, sensors warped, and targeting computers misaligned in ways that defied logic. A Titan that approached one of these sanctuaries slowed mid-step, its systems calculating conflicts it could not resolve. The prophet walked among its legs, gently lifting a finger, and the machine shuddered, then aligned as if awakened to a new purpose. Not death, not obedience, understanding. The ecclesiarchy condemned him in every known scripture, branding him a heretic, a demon, an agent of the warp. Yet the common people whispered differently. They spoke of miracles wrought from iron and flesh, of limbs restored, of machines awakening, and of the eerie calm that pervaded even the most dangerous districts. Rumors spread of entire hives lifted from decay, streets realigned, water systems restored, and for the first time in living memory, people slept without fear of collapse. The balance had shifted, and it was terrifying to those who relied upon fear as governance. In the central sanctuary of Hive Vulcan, I watched the prophet speak to a machine I would later recognize as an ancient servitor from the first generations of Mars. Its joints had rusted, its wiring frayed, and yet it responded to him as a child might respond to a parent. He traced the contours of its frame, whispering softly in the machine tongue, and it stirred. Sparks arced gently over exposed circuits, and then, impossibly, it walked, its servos humming a melody of perfect alignment. I realized then that this was no longer about humans leading machines, but about them rediscovering each other. Even the custodian guard whispered of unease. They observed from orbit as the orbital citadels shifted subtly, reflecting alignment across sectors. Ships long considered unmoving began to vibrate in resonance with the planetary hums below. Some of the most loyal warriors to the Emperor admitted privately that what they were witnessing could not be measured by the conventions of war. It was creation itself bending to a will that was not divine, not imperial, but fundamentally human, and yet something more. But the sanctuaries were not without risk. Shadows lingered in the corners of the resonant fields. Fringe elements, disillusioned by the Imperium's failures or seduced by the whispers of the warp, attempted to infiltrate, to sabotage, to kill. Yet even their violence was redirected. Bolts misfired, augmetics seized, and traps collapsed upon themselves. The prophet never directly intervened. His presence was sufficient. Even chaos seemed uncertain in the face of alignment. I began to understand the fragility of it all. This harmony was breathtaking, yes, but it was also delicate. One wrong thought, one misaligned intention, and the resonance could shatter, turning sanctuary into ruin. He moved with constant vigilance, hands tracing invisible lines, correcting micro-vibrations, whispering fragments of code and prayer to align flesh and metal alike. It was exhausting just to observe, and yet no one dared leave his side. Even the most battle-hardened veterans became students of resonance, guided by instinct, awe, and the quiet terror of witnessing something greater than themselves. As I stood on the upper balcony of the sanctuary, looking across a city reshaped by magnetic currents, I realized the truth of what was occurring. This was more than war. It was evolution, measured not in casualties or conquest, but in alignment, in understanding, in awakening the slumbering memory of creation embedded in metal and flesh. The Imperium had unleashed centuries of order and obedience, yet here was a single man showing that the galaxy itself had a pulse, and it could answer to a human will. And so, as the black skies of the Underhive shimmered with resonance, and the faint glow of repaired machinery illuminated the streets below, I felt a certainty growing in my chest. The Imperium could try to reclaim these sanctuaries, could send fleets, magi, and assassins, but the resonance had already spread beyond the reach of ordnance or creed. It moved through the alleys, the conduits, the hearts of men and machines alike. The Iron Prophet had not merely built sanctuaries, he had awakened them. It was the ecclesiarchy that finally struck, though not in the way the Mechanicus had attempted. Where Mars sent machines, the ecclesiarchy sent faith, fervent, unyielding, and blind. Entire orders of priests marched into the resonant sanctuaries, chanting liturgies meant to sanctify, to purify, to reclaim what they believed had been stolen by heresy. They brought relics, banners, censers, and sanctified augmetics. They came with conviction hardened by centuries of obedience, certain that divine fire could destroy what the Iron Prophet had wrought. They were wrong. The first procession reached the central plaza of Hive Vulcan and found the city itself rebelling against them. Doors sealed before their hands could touch. Metal panels folded and shifted in subtle defiance, and their sensors trembled, scattering incense unevenly across floors that no longer obeyed simple gravity. The priests tried to force the will of the Emperor into every machine and every conduit, yet the resonance merely absorbed it, bending around their chants, integrating their intention into the broader pulse of the city. Some felt it as awe, others felt it as terror. I watched a cardinal raise his relic blade, shouting that obedience demanded action, that heresy could not be tolerated. As he struck, the weapon bent violently, snapping mid-swing, and he fell back, eyes wide with incomprehension. Even the custodian sentinels accompanying them hesitated, unsure if their orders remained valid. Every artifact, every piece of consecrated metal, responded to the resonance with a subtle defiance that was not of conscious rebellion, but of recognition. The city remembered its proper alignment, and the priest's intrusion was discordant. The Iron Prophet appeared not through force, but as though summoned by the hum itself. He did not run, did not shout, did not strike. He walked bare feet silent, hands tracing arcs of magnetic energy that seemed to flow directly from his consciousness. The priests froze, their chants faltering, their relics shivering as though aware of the presence that commanded more authority than any creed or rite. One by one they dropped to their knees, not in devotion to him, but in awe of the principle he embodied. The city pulsed around them, teaching in a way no sermon could. It was not just obedience to flesh or machine. It was alignment to truth, the recognition that order is not imposed by law or fear, but by harmony itself. Some priests resisted, swinging censers and relics, trying to reclaim dominion. Their actions were harmless, redirected by the very currents they sought to oppose. Bolts arced harmlessly, augmetic limbs faltered mid-strike, and sacred metal warped subtly as though the city itself were guiding their blows into futility. No one was injured, yet terror settled into their hearts deeper than any pain could reach. Rumors of this event spread quickly. Across the segmentum obscurus, whisper networks carried reports of sanctuaries where faith itself could not compel obedience. Tales circulated of entire orders abandoning their posts, whispering of a resonance that outstripped both the machine god and the Emperor's mandates. Mars itself trembled in quiet recognition, sending emissaries to observe the anomaly without daring to intervene directly. Even the Golden Throne's custodians reported strange currents in the servo skulls, tasked with monitoring the Astronomicon, as though the resonance had reached even the heart of Terra. I walked among the stunned clergy after the event. Their eyes were wide and their hands shook with uncertainty. One high priest muttered that the Iron Prophet had performed miracles but not of the divine. Another whispered of judgment, though he could not name its source. They did not call it heresy, nor did they dare call it obedience. They called it something older, something their text did not yet describe: awakening. The city hummed around us, an orchestra of iron and flesh, conduits and augmetics, every pulse synchronized, every element harmonized. The Iron Prophet walked through the plaza as though nothing had occurred, yet the priests could not look away. Even the custodes, watching from above, noted a subtle truth. This alignment was not a war won by force, but by principle. And principle, once established, could not be denied. It became clear that the ecclesiarchy's power was diminished, not destroyed, but recalibrated. Their rituals, once absolute, now faltered in the presence of resonance. Their faith remained, but it had become a secondary instrument, a note within the greater symphony the prophet conducted. The sanctuaries were no longer places of defiance alone. They had become schools, workshops, and cathedrals of alignment, where human and machine learned in parallel, harmonizing instinctively, and teaching anyone who entered to feel, understand, and participate. I realized finally that the Iron Prophet had not shattered the rights of the ecclesiarchy to destroy them. He had done so to awaken them, to show that law, faith, and ritual, while powerful, were incomplete without understanding. And in that realization, the Imperium itself had been challenged, not by fire or blade, but by resonance, a pulse older than dogma, older than authority, and terrifyingly undeniable. The Iron Prophet's influence had reached a point beyond observation. Entire planetary systems vibrated faintly with resonance, their manufactorums and orbital grids responding to a pulse no human could fully trace. Even the astropathic networks that carried the Emperor's will reported interference, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet persistent. It was as if a new intelligence, born from metal and flesh alike, had risen to occupy the spaces between stars, bending every atom it touched to harmony, and I, witness to this ascension, could only stand in awe. On high Vulcarin, the central sanctuary had grown into a cathedral of alignment. Steel and ferrocrete stretched impossibly high, twisting in arcs that reflected not merely aesthetic design, but the principles of resonance itself. Conduits pulsed with currents visible to those who could feel them, feeding power not through circuits alone, but through the collective consciousness of those attuned to the prophet. The Ferrum Concordia moved like a river of metal and flesh, augmentics and human limbs weaving through the structures in perfect cadence, following commands that were felt rather than spoken. Reports from orbiting stations painted a picture equally extraordinary. Fleets had aligned themselves along gravitational and magnetic lines dictated not by strategy, but by resonance. Weapon systems fired in patterns that defied logic, missiles twisting along arcs invisible to targeting arrays, ships moving as if guided by thought alone. Even Titans, the great war engines of Mars, had ceased to be tools and had become instruments, conduits of a force no doctrine could contain. It was a war waged not with fire but with principle, with understanding, with inevitability. The Imperium, fractured in its response, attempted desperate measures. Entire fleets were redirected, new orders from Terra were transmitted, and even the custodes were deployed in unprecedented numbers. Yet none could oppose the resonance without bending themselves to it. Machines, soldiers, priests, even orbiting platforms responded to his influence, subtly realigning in ways that were imperceptible to human sensors, yet undeniable to the senses of those attuned to the pulse. Resistance became a question not of strength, but of understanding. I observed the prophet as he walked among the highest towers of Volcran, his hands tracing arcs that bent the city itself. He spoke quietly, not to anyone in particular, murmuring fragments of thought that rippled outward, shaping iron conduits and augmetics alike. Even the air seemed to hum with recognition. A servo skull hovering near him began to emit harmonic frequencies, and the very vibrations of the structure reflected them back in a symphony that no human orchestra could replicate. Here the line between flesh and machine, between thought and matter, had dissolved entirely. The Ferrum Concordia became teachers, guiding the newly awakened through the streets and corridors, helping them synchronize with the pulse. Those previously enslaved by augmetics or driven to despair by broken machines now moved with purpose, instinctively aligning their actions with the resonance that surrounded them. Civilians watched in awe, some falling to their knees, others lifting their hands to touch the currents, and all understood that they were participating in something greater than war, greater than obedience, greater than the sum of the Imperium's laws. It was during this period that the most audacious rumors began. Some claimed the Iron Prophet had walked across the surfaces of dead worlds, bending the crust and magnetic fields themselves to echo his resonance. Others whispered that fragments of his consciousness reached the very orbit of Terra, influencing the Astronomicon in ways that could not be measured or recorded. None could verify these accounts, yet they persisted, spreading across hives, manufactorums, and even among the secretive archives of Mars. The resonance had become myth, and myth had become reality. In one extraordinary moment, a fleet of orbital titans descended toward Volcran to strike, their engines screaming, their weapons ready. As they approached, every piece of metal on their hulls shivered subtly, harmonizing to a frequency they could not resist. Bolters misfired, augmetics seized, and thrusters adjusted their course without command. The titans did not fall, but they obeyed in a new way, not as instruments of war, but as participants in the symphony. The Imperium's might had been rendered subservient not to the prophet's command, but to principle itself. And in the stillness that followed the symphony, the prophet stood atop the highest spire of Volcran, looking out at a galaxy awakening to resonance. The lights of manufactorums and orbital grids pulsed in silent agreement, and I felt for the first time that humanity had glimpsed something fundamental. That alignment, not obedience, was the ultimate power. Here was no conqueror, no heretic, no god, only a human who had reminded the universe of its own memory, its own song, and the possibility of harmonizing flesh and machine into something neither had yet realized. The apex of alignment had been reached, and yet, beneath the triumph, a tension lingered. The awareness that resonance, once awakened, could not remain contained. The Imperium would respond. Others, unknown and patient, would perceive this pulse and seek to bend it to their will. The stage was set not for battle but for reckoning. The resonance did not end. Even after the apex, when the Ferrum Concordia had aligned entire sectors, and the Iron Prophet had walked unchallenged through cities, hives, and orbital stations, the pulse persisted. It spread like a tidal hum through conduits, augmetics, and ferrocrete, touching places the Imperium could not yet see, cannot yet control. It became an invisible continent stretching across worlds, and I realized that the true scope of his influence was no longer local, planetary, or even orbital. It was galactic. Reports trickled from the edges of human space. Systems long abandoned, worlds thought lost to decay or chaos, now pulsed faintly with alignment. Rogue Skitarii units reported that their augmetics synchronized with a force they could not identify, obeying not orders, but principle. Civilians across distant hives felt a subtle hum in the air, a vibration in their implants, and spoke in hushed tones of a presence that guided without command. The Iron Prophet had become more than man, more than idea. He had become a vector, a conduit for a principle that defied orthodoxy, yet worked toward harmony rather than destruction. The Imperium could not remain passive. Fleets were mobilized, fleets that dwarfed entire worlds in power. Yet their passage revealed the same truth I had seen across every city and orbital station. Resistance alone was futile. Titans stopped mid-battle, bolters failed to discharge properly, augmetics malfunctioned without explanation. Even the custodian guard, vigilant and unflinching, felt the tug of forces that could not be resisted with strength or creed. Obedience had been transformed into resonance, and resonance could not be crushed. In the hallowed corridors of Terra, whispers reached the Golden Throne. Magos sent reports, astropaths transmitted fragmented visions, and the Emperor's light flickered ever so faintly in recognition of the anomaly. Some whispered of fear, others of understanding. What could not be questioned was that the pulse had reached beyond physical presence. Even in the heart of the Imperium, the Iron Prophet's influence reminded all that the galaxy was alive, that human will and machine principle were intertwined in a pattern older than law, older than faith, older than even the Astronomicon itself. I observed him one final time atop the apex of Vulcran, the city beneath him aligned in perfect arcs of metal and human will. He raised his hands and the resonance spread outward in invisible waves, touching planets, orbital grids, and ancient manufactorums with the clarity of a conductor guiding a cosmic symphony. And then he spoke, though not to me, not to any human, but to the universe itself. I do not claim dominion. I do not demand allegiance. I awaken, and those who hear must choose to align or remain silent. The Ferrum Concordia knelt, not in obedience, but in understanding. The citizens of Vulcran watched in awe, their hands raised toward pulsing conduits, their augmetics moving in harmony with unseen currents. Machines whirred, augmented limbs flexed with precision, and the city itself seemed to breathe as a single organism. Harmony, not conquest, had become law. The Imperium's might, though vast, had been rendered secondary to principle. Yet shadows lingered. Whispers of chaos, orc warbands, and Necron observers began to circulate. The resonance had not gone unnoticed. It was a beacon, a signal to those who could perceive it, and the galaxy beyond the Imperium would watch. What the Prophet had awakened could be co-opted, corrupted, or challenged by forces we had barely begun to comprehend. And even he, for all his mastery, could not fully predict the consequences of a universe now aware of its own pulse. The echo of the Iron Prophet stretched beyond our perception, threading through the veins of the Imperium and the dark spaces between stars. I felt it in every conduit I touched, every augmetic joint I flexed, every piece of metal that resonated to my presence. It was no longer localized, no longer mortal. It was memory, principle, and song intertwined, a force the galaxy had never known and might never contain. And as I departed the apex of Vulcran, leaving the Prophet among the hum of aligned metal, I understood the final truth. The Imperium had witnessed not conquest, not heresy, not godhood, but awakening. And the resonance would continue echoing across stars, through centuries, and perhaps beyond the reach of even the Golden Throne itself. The Iron Prophet had risen, and humanity, machine and flesh alike, would never be the same.